Sure, no problem. All right, well, everyone, thank you for reassembling. I know others will be in shortly. The issue of terrorism, as we've all discussed, knows no boundaries, and therefore counterterrorism must know no boundaries and borders. And therefore, it's not sufficient that in a forum on Homeland Security counterterrorism that we hear from only one foreign perspective. We need international cooperation in order to defeat terrorism. So to complement the remarks that we heard earlier today from Ambassador Haqqani, we will hear from two other perspectives that in one way or another represent the international point of view. So that's why I've titled this session, The View from Abroad. To moderate this session, we're very, very pleased to have Robert Siegel, who is known to all of us listeners of NPR. As we all know, Robert Siegel is the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening news magazine, All Things Considered. As a host, Siegel has reported from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Israel. He now concentrates on domestic stories. Before joining All Things Considered in 1987, Robert served for 4 years as director of NPR's News and Information Department, overseeing production of NPR's news magazines All Things Considered and Morning Edition. He joined NPR in December 1976 as an associate producer and was appointed public affairs editor in 1977, senior editor the following year. In 1979, he was chosen to open NPR's London bureau, where he worked as senior editor until 1983. Robert's very well known throughout the country, especially here in Aspen, and I'm delighted to have you to moderate this panel.
Thank you very much, Clark, and thanks to you and to Walter Isaacson for inviting me and for organizing this conference in Aspen. It's a delight to be here, and should this be replayed at all on Aspen Public Radio, a special hello to listeners and supporters of our station here. The title, "The View from Abroad," is extremely broad, but I think that the panelists beside me bring a breadth of experience to the questions at hand that's quite remarkable. Henry Crumpton, sitting in the center, was either an officer or a station chief with the CIA on 4 continents. Prior to 9/11, we didn't know about it at the time. He was urging that more attention be paid to Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. Post 9/11, he was the man who led the chase of bin Laden that ended, alas, in bin Laden's escape at Tora Bora. Richard Barrett is coordinator of the UN's Al-Qaida Taliban monitoring project. Before taking that job in 2004, Richard served in the British Foreign Office, Security Service, and Secret Security Service in, among other places, Turkey and Jordan. And as I say, he's now been at the UN in an office that advises the Security Council on these matters for the past several years. I'd like to begin, since both of you have thought longer and harder about Al-Qaida than nearly anyone I know, to ask you a question that's perhaps a little bit beside our central focus. It's what you imagine the view to be of all the things we've been hearing about, of 2 individuals, Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. That is, do you think that these men, knowing as much as we know, figure pretty good? It's almost 9 years. We're still around. Pakistanis haven't pushed us out. We've spawned all kinds of local franchises in different countries. They're going to get lucky one of these days. The American public is souring on the war in Afghanistan. Their allies don't seem terribly interested in joining them. We're going to win this thing. One big strike, and people will say we triumphed. Or is it, here we are stuck in the tribal areas of northern Pakistan, and we can only get lone wolf nut jobs who have U.S. passports who are incapable of detonating a car or a shoe or their underpants. So we're under a lot of pressure. Which is it? What do you think, Hank? Do you think they feel that they're winning this thing or that they're losing this thing?
I think from their perspective, it is an existential struggle. It is about their identity. It defines who they are. It defines the world as they would like it to be, as perverse as that might be to us. So they're in it for the long haul. And I think that they will continue to fight until they are either captured or killed. And that's important for us when we think about the strategic value of enemy leadership. It's paramount. I do think there is frustration, confusion within the ranks because of the decimation of Al-Qaeda leadership, except for those 2. Ambassador Haqqani earlier noted that if you're the number 3 guy in Al-Qaeda, your life expectancy is measured in months. It's not a job anybody really wants. And that creates a lot of confusion. And they have had enormous setbacks since the denial of Afghanistan as the major safe haven for them. Many attacks have been disrupted. Perhaps 3,000 operatives in the last 9 years have been captured or killed worldwide. So they're under stress. And the reason that we and our allies have not been able to capture or kill either one of the two is because they are in hiding. And they have restricted themselves in their movement and their communications, and that burden has fallen to the number 3. So I think it's a mix. They're determined. For them, it's an existential conflict, but they're also under enormous stress. And I might add that if you look at public opinion in the Muslim world, the support for the ideology that Al-Qaeda professes is dropping. It hit a high mark when Zarqawi hit that wedding party in Jordan, that horrible attack. And if you look at Pew Research polls and others, from that point on, it started to decline. And I think bin Laden knows that.
Richard, what do you think? What do you think their sense of where they stand is?
Yes, I absolutely agree with Hank on that. They are in for the long term, and they must think, well, we're still there. You know, they haven't got us yet. But nonetheless, the net is closing. And I think if I were Osama bin Laden preparing my State of the Union address, as it were, I would say, well, okay, we haven't had such a good last couple of years, but nonetheless, we're determined, we're resilient, you know, and we just lack opportunity, but opportunity will come our way if we stick it out. And so far as brand recognition is concerned, they've done exceptionally well. I mean, here we all are in Aspen over the last 48 hours just talking about them, although it's already a good 9 years after the attacks of 9/11. And I think the attacks of 9/11 were quite extraordinary, exceeded even their expectations in terms of both impact and you know, the increase in their fame. I think, though, that they do have very real vulnerabilities, and I think they're very aware of those vulnerabilities. Hank's mentioned some, and certainly on the areas of their legitimacy, on their credibility, and even on their relevance to world events. I think they've seen a deterioration in their position. I think that Hank makes a very important point about the Amman moment, you know, that point in Amman when the attacks on the weddings changed public opinion in Amman dramatically from support of Al-Qaeda as being, yeah, you know, they're good guys, really sort of the Robin Hoods of our world, to no, these are just revolting criminals involved in things which we can't possibly support. And I think that is something which is spread right across the Muslim world. And I think that their burning desire to lead a mass movement is probably, you know, a little bit compromised by that. Now, they can't quite see perhaps where that mass movement's coming from.
Before leaving the Al-Qaeda leadership, are they important beyond a symbolic role right now? If Al-Qaeda were decapitated now, and I'll ask you, Hank Crumpton, if they'd been decapitated back in December 2001, for that matter, would that essentially be the end of it, or is it a movement not dependent on this charismatic leadership?
The leadership is of critical importance. If you look at counterinsurgency, successful counterinsurgency campaigns, and this has many parallels, there are 3 strategic objectives. You must nullify enemy leadership. That means you kill them or you capture them or you undermine their legitimacy. And number 2 is you must deny them safe haven, a place where they can recuperate, organize, plot, plan, train, and deploy. And then third, and this is the big one, you have to address the conditions, often very local conditions, the enemy exploits. You have to do all 3. So decapitation alone would not have ended this war. It would have been a major success, but that's only one of 3 strategic goals. So from that perspective, we still have a lot of work to do, because there are others that are willing to step forward, and they have repeatedly. It is a movement. They have affiliates, and it is a dynamic network that continues to learn and adapt and change, and we have to change with it.
Richard Barrett, how important are those 2?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of talk about decapitation and the merits of decapitation as a policy in counterterrorism, but what is interesting is, so far as Al-Qaeda is concerned, they believe in decapitation. If you look at their activities, for example, in Iraq, they've been very much involved in removing tribal leaders, removing leaders of the awakening movement, and so on. In Pakistan, the same, removing tribal elders who are opposed to Al-Qaida and the Taliban, removing imams who are speaking against them. In Afghanistan, you see the same thing with attack on politicians, senior police chiefs, and stuff like that. There's no doubt, indeed, if you look at terrorist movements around the world, that they really spark when there's a charismatic leader in charge. Osama bin Laden clearly has that charismatic appeal. You know, he's become a figure on a T-shirt, a Che Guevara type figure. You know, he's good-looking, you know, noble sort of person. And that charisma, I think, will probably survive his death. I think, nonetheless, to remove him from the scene probably would have ultimately a positive effect in terms of counterterrorism. Zawahiri, I would say the complete reverse. Zawahiri is a very unpleasant character. He's never been charismatic. He's always made enemies wherever he's been. And if you watch the videos, which I hope you don't because they're tedious to the extreme, he sits there wagging his finger, you know, admonishing everybody to do this, that, and the other. So the longer he's around, I think the better it is for us.
The longer Bin Laden knows Zawahiri.
Bin Laden knows Zawahiri key.
Hank Crumpton said the reason we haven't caught Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri is they're in hiding. To a great many Americans, and Ambassador Haqqani addressed this, it's a puzzlement. How is it that they're presumed to be on the soil of an allied country, and that that country has now mobilized? They've been there since late 2001 or early 2002 and can't be found. In your view, is that despite a truly vigorous and effective counter-terrorism effort? I'll ask Richard Barrett first, in Pakistan.
Yes, well, there's absolutely no doubt that Pakistan is very concerned about the situation with the Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban. And I think we have to make some distinctions here between not only the Pakistan Taliban and the Afghan Taliban, but also within the Pakistan Taliban itself, from tribe to tribe and so on. And then within the Afghan Taliban, of course, you have the Haqqani group, which is a big complication because it remains so close to Al-Qaida and also close to some of the Tehrik Taliban, some of the Pakistan Taliban people. And then there's Hekmatyar up further to the north, who's really no longer so much of a player, but has traditionally been very close to the Pakistan authorities. So the Pakistan government has a big fear, of course, that there could be a movement which results in a greater Pashtunistan. You know, that Pashtuns, two-thirds of them, I think there are about 40 million of them, two-thirds of them in Afghanistan, and about a third in Pakistan. And if they break off because there's no proper settlement in Afghanistan, that will be very bad for Pakistan too, to see a large chunk of territory move away and possibly a semi-hostile state emerge. So it needs to do things about that. It needs to fight the Tehrik Taliban as well. It needs to be aware of its capabilities. And I remember General Kayani saying at a lunch I was with him, well, okay, you keep on pushing us to do this, that, and the other. What if we lose? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think that, you know, that is a realistic scenario for them. You know, maybe they can't define what losing would be, but they might. Therefore, they have to approach the problem in very many different ways. One of them will be vigorous military action. Another will be negotiation. Another will be to try and keep their influences where they can and exert them to, you know, cause divides and so on within the various groups they're facing. So all I'm trying to say is that when you say, do Pakistan take a vigorous approach in counterterrorism, well, I think they pursue their own interests, and they're very good at identifying their own interests, and that requires quite a vigorous approach to counterterrorism.
Do you agree?
I do, and also fundamentally, manhunting is very hard. Throughout history, Alexander the Great, he chased King Darius for 2 years, never caught him. Eventually, the Persian king's men killed him, and Alexander found the body. General Pershing chased Pancho Villa in Mexico, never caught him. FBI, they pursued the 10 most wanted here within our borders for years and years. So fundamentally, manhunting is hard, particularly if you're talking about this part of the world on the Afghan-Pakistan border. But moreover, and it goes to an issue of counterinsurgency, it is multifaceted. And without a robust counterinsurgency plan and effort, the chances of getting bin Laden are diminished. And that really is about local support. That really is the key. It's about the people. We can talk about the physical terrain, which is daunting, but even more daunting is the human terrain in that part of the world. And you have to understand that terrain, you have to map it, and you have to get it on your side.
If I may come back on that, because I think it's a very important point about the human terrain. Just as there was that Oman moment in 2006 with the attack on the weddings, I think also last year there was a sort of Pakistan moment with the video of the young girl being flogged by the Taliban leader in some village up near Peshawar. I think the Pakistan people were really revolted by that, and that turned a lot of people against Taliban and these sort of fundamentalist ideas. And I think Ambassador Haqqani mentioned that 17% of Pakistanis support American policies generally, or have a favorable view.
I mean, it's a Pew Research Center
yeah, that's
number,
right, a Pew Research Center number. And I think the same Pew Research poll showed that only about the same amount supported the Taliban. And I think a really critical turnaround in Pakistan is that anti-Americanism does not translate anymore into support for Taliban or Al-Qaida. That is a very significant change for Pakistan, and a very significant change for the army, because the army now can move against, let's admit it, other Pakistanis. They're fighting their own people, but with public support behind them.
You're saying we should read the Taliban's negatives as carefully as we read our own negatives in these polls. Time. The timetable discussion in this country is President Obama suggesting that come July 2011 we should start drawing down the number of troops that were added during the surge in Afghanistan. Admiral Mullen saying the other day that the latest offensive in Afghanistan and Kandahar will be postponed a bit. We won't know how it's gone until the end of this year, and he believes as Kandahar goes, so goes Afghanistan. Somewhere between December 31st and early January, the U.S. has to figure out whether it's in a position to reduce troops. That's our time pressure. When you talk to people in the larger Southwest Asian region, or in Pakistan for that matter, first of all, what's their timetable? Do they think that we've heard it long enough that they're in it for the long haul and the Soviets ran away, we ran away? Or do they assume that sooner or later the U.S. is going to pull out?
I think many in the Taliban believe that the U.S. will pull out. And that's what they tell the Afghan villagers. They often comment that the Americans have the watches, but we have the time, which means that they don't have a timeline because that is their home. They have nowhere else to go.
You work with them, they'll be leaving.
That's
You'll
right.
be left all
That's
alone.
right. And immediately after 9/11 in Afghanistan, working with our Afghan allies, I was often asked, are you going to stick with us this time? Referring to our promises made during the Soviet occupation, when we told the Afghans that after we win this together, we will be here with you. We will help you redevelop your country. The Afghans remember that, and they're wondering, are we going to stick with them? And not just the U.S., but the global community of nations. Are we with the Afghan people in this fledgling democracy? And I don't have the answer. I wish and at the time I told them, yes, we're with you. Today, based on the political atmosphere, I don't know. I don't know the answer.
Well, it's been several years. We're still there. Have we gained any credibility on that score among these people?
Well, not when the president announces a timeline for withdrawal, and you don't see the non-military application of power, the economic development, the health care. Now, we've spent some money, but very little has gotten to the villages, have gotten to the Afghan people. 9 years ago, only 6% of the Afghan people were on the electric grid. Today, only 6% of the Afghan people are on the electric grid. And you look, there's been some progress, particularly in public education for young boys and particularly for young women, girls. So it's not without some progress, but overall we have a long way to go.
Richard Barrett, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there are quite a lot of things to say about these timelines. One interesting thing is the close attention that Taliban pay to what's going on in Washington, what's going on in London, what's going on in the other capitals of troop contributors. You know, they're quite likely to quote the NPR or the Washington Post or the New York Times or something, or even some study done by one of the think tanks in Washington or London. And it's very interesting how aware they are of the domestic public opinion pressures on governments to deal with this and get it done. and they play to that, of course. And they do believe, of course, as Hank says, that time is on their side because they're not going anywhere. They're Afghans, they're going to stay there. But nonetheless, there are time factors which affect them too. If you look at Karzai and his government, Karzai is desperate to get something moving because he's worried, of course, that the American and other coalition forces will withdraw before he's strong enough to survive their withdrawal, which he wouldn't survive at the moment. He's very worried that he's going to end up like Najibullah, strung from a lamppost somewhere in Kabul. So he's under pressure of time. Therefore, that pushes his efforts to reconcile or start talks. That comes onto the Pakistanis, and the Pakistanis are under pressure of time because for the moment they still have some influence with senior Taliban in the Quetta Shura, with Haqqani group, with Hekmatyar and so on. But for how long that will last, that's another matter. These people are maybe drifting away from them to a certain extent. And the Taliban are under time pressure too, because although to a certain, sometimes quite surprising extent, the Quetta Shura have control over what's happening across Afghanistan with the shadow governors, the shadow military leaders, and so on. Nonetheless, there are more and more young commanders now who got involved in this really since 2001, who, okay, we'll go along with them there in Quetta when it suits us, but otherwise, actually, we're building our own local power bases, or we're now much more independent because we're getting drug money and so on. We're moving more into criminality. And so the Taliban themselves have a time problem. The more it goes on, the less control they'll have. So I think actually time pressures are impinging on everybody, though they may be slightly different.
I'd like to ask you both about the two most recent attempted attacks, the Christmas Day attempted airline bombing and the Times Square attempted car bombing, and what those incidents said to you about what's happening overseas. We heard Ambassador Haqqani reading in the Times Square event 100% cooperation between Pakistani and U.S. counterterrorism forces. How did those events play out beyond our shores in the region where they originated? What do you think?
I think that there is a diverse perspective and diverse interpretation of those events. You have some of those adhere to conspiracy theories, dismiss it altogether, think it's something that we
staged a fake bombing
that we cooked up, and it's hard to overstate how much traction that gains in parts of South Asia. This type of thinking and debate, and it's in some of the mainstream media even. So that's on one extreme. On the others, on the other end of the spectrum, you have well-informed, responsible leaders who understand that if there is a successful attack in the U.S., there will be consequences for Pakistan, and they're concerned and they're working more and more with the U.S. to address it. And then there's a broad range within this spectrum.
Richard Barrett.
Yes, if I can take those two instances, Faisal Shahzad and Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, separately. I think the first one, the Times Square one, if I can take that first, although chronologically second. The consequences, as seen in South Asia, are to suddenly find that you've got this young, hothead member of the Massoud tribe, which is a relatively small and insignificant tribe in Pakistan, Hakimullah Massoud, on national TV all over the world. And to some extent...
He is the mentor to Shahzad when he had been in Pakistan.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, he was the guy whose video came out immediately afterwards saying we were responsible, and there was a picture of him in front of a map of the United States with various explosions happening, and so all the wonderful dramatic stuff. And indeed, they were involved in that. And so for him, he's suddenly made it to the big time. He's suddenly no longer a small-time crook in the highlands and wildlands of Pakistan, but he's now a national figure and an international figure. And that for him is great because it'll bring more resources, more recruits. That'll be helpful. On the other hand, though, if you look at the Abdul Muttalib case, if we can say that it originated in Yemen, though obviously I think his radicalization occurred more in London than it did in Yemen, but nonetheless, if we say it originated in Yemen, the Yemeni government will react in several ways to that. First of all, they'll be very fearful that there'll be a direct American intervention somehow as a result of that. And I think a lot of countries fear the consequences of any direct military intervention by the United States because it will tend to combine the population opposed to the government, opposed to US intervention. So they would worry about that. But also they would see, yes, this is an opportunity, because we have huge problems. I mean, in Yemen, for example, I think over 60% of the population is under 25. There's about 30% youth unemployment. There's up to 1 million Somali refugees there, which adds to the economic problems. Sana'a will be the first major capital to run out of water, probably within the next 10 years. The oil revenues are falling. They'll run out of oil by 2017. They're already a net importer of oil. They've got a secessionist movement in the south. They've got a rebellion in the north. Al-Qaeda comes pretty low down on that, But Al-Qaeda, if the United States, the European Union, and other big donors see Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula being a threat to their own security, you can see resources flowing in, seeing help coming in, and maybe that's not such a bad thing. So there's a sort of managing that threat, playing it up, playing it down, so that you maximize the resources that can flow in. I'm not trying to be too cynical with this, but I mean, that's just a fact of the matter.
You mentioned the case of Abdul Muttalib probably having been radicalized more in London, where he was a university student, than in Yemen, where he evidently made contact with Alaki, whom we've heard about. Which brings us to Britain, and by extension, I'll be very American and say the rest of Europe. Yeah. How well coordinated is counterterrorism between the U.S. and Europe today?
Well, I think it's pretty good. And as Michael Leiter said earlier, there's a very close relationship between the American agencies and the UK agencies, and that is, predates 9/11 by a very, very long time. Clearly, everyone's trying to promote their own interests, and any relationship has to recognize the interests of the other side and to help with that. I think whether you're talking about Europe, whether you're talking about Canada, for example, or other countries which are their security is so closely allied with the security of the United States, you're bound to see a coincidence of interest. I think when it gets beyond that, it becomes a bit more complicated. And in this world of counterterrorism, Europeans, North Americans, other Western states, you can sort of pretty much rely on, see things in the same way. But the partners we really need, of course, are Pakistan, are Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Morocco, maybe even now some countries of the Sahel. And so it becomes a much more complicated relationship to manage. And it's all very well that US, UK, France, whatever, may share the same perspective, but that's not enough anymore.
Hank Crumpton, your sense of European counterterrorism?
It varies. Extraordinarily close with the British, the Dutch, and some others, but some pretty big gaps in other countries. The Poles are great allies, I should note. There is a sense of entitlement, a culture of entitlement in many European countries, and not only reflected in their social programs, and they're having to suffer through some dramatic budget cuts because of it, but there's also a sense that they are entitled to U.S. defense umbrella. We won the Cold War in concert with our allies, and somehow they expect that to continue. But if you look at a lot of our NATO allies, they have never lived up to their financial obligations. And they're going through even more budget cuts in their defense expenditures. The Europeans should not assume that the U.S. will always be there as their behavior continues with this particular sense of entitlement. So I think there is a possibility of some divergence with some European countries, although intelligence sharing, I think, will continue, and the macro policies will continue for now, but that's not a given forever.
Let me ask you a pretty speculative question, but one that draws on your experience as ambassador at large for counterterrorism and yours at the United Nations. We just heard a panel earlier that described what the next attack might be like, and we've heard a panel express their belief in the likelihood of another strike against the U.S. Let's say there's another big, terrible attack that costs great loss of life here, and its return address is not the tribal areas of Pakistan, but perhaps somewhere near the Horn of Africa or in the Arabian Peninsula. Is the potential will there, or the interest among our allies there, to launch another multinational response to such an attack as there was after 9/11, Or is the world somehow exhausted with this right now? Do they regard it as essentially our problem, and we've been in it long enough that, that clearly it's our war? What do you think?
I think it's an important distinction, and you use the word attack. Often pundits and others will refer to the invasion of Afghanistan post 9/11, after 9/11, and it was not an invasion. If you look at the fall of Kandahar, the last major urban stronghold of Al-Qaida and the Taliban, that was December 7th, 2001. At that point in time, less than 90 days after 9/11, there were only 410 Americans on the ground in Afghanistan. Now, you had terrific air power, you had intelligence, you had logistics support, but it was an Afghan victory. And you ask Afghans about that campaign, it was their victory. Now, you compare that to the invasion of Iraq. So to answer your question, it depends on, well, how do we respond to that attack? How do we define the enemy? And in Afghanistan, after 9/11, we defined the enemy in very narrow terms. It was Al-Qaida and those Taliban leaders who chose to side with Al-Qaida. Bear in mind, there were many Taliban leaders who are now part of the government because they made a risk calculus and said, we think we'll go with our Afghan brothers and the Americans, not with Al-Qaida and Mullah Omar. So that's
Taliban.
Yeah, Taliban. So it's really important that we define the enemy, and then we're very precise, very nuanced in our response, which is hard for the U.S. to do because of our conventional military, because of our power. We love blunt force trauma because we're so good at it. But in this type of conflict, the more precise, the more nuanced, the more you develop local networks, trusted networks, and have them be the victors. That's how you succeed in this kind of war.
Richard Barrett, what do you think about what the international response would be to 9/11 Take Two?
I think it'd be very unlikely to be a military response. I think Hank's absolutely right. It's all about perception and about domestic support too, which drives these political things. And I think that clearly so soon after the Iraq and Afghan campaigns, which continue, let's admit, I think that the international community would be very, very wary of even believing that it could be successful, let alone believing that it could be possible. So what happens? I mean, if you look at, you mentioned the Horn of Africa, for example. Let's look at that, Somalia, for a moment. Ethiopia moved into Somalia, if you remember, I think at the end of 2007, and stayed for about a year before pulling out. And when the Ethiopians moved in to try and shore up the transitional federal government, and which was recognized internationally, there was an immediate swell of opposition against it and support for Al-Shabaab and other groups that existed at that time. And I think that is likely to happen wherever. You can't step into any of these places. I mean, Somalia is a particularly problematic place. You can't step into anywhere without there being unintended and unexpected consequences. We've seen it in Iraq, of course, we've seen it in Afghanistan. We would see it in the Middle East, in the Horn of Africa, or anywhere else. And I think that if you have a public which is mature enough and sophisticated enough in its understanding of what lies behind an attack and what can be done about an attack to prevent another attack rather than retaliate against that attack, then I think you're okay. It's only when the public demand action, as they probably did after 9/11, there was, what are we going to do? We've got to do something about this. That was a sort of obvious enemy, if you like, and there was a very quick and successful campaign to dislodge the Taliban. That's fine. I don't think those conditions are going to pertain again.
So a tempered response would be an asset.
Yeah, and we in a way, we've already started the response for the next attack.
We are poised to work in those.
Doing that.
I wouldn't use the word temperate response.
Tempered is what I meant.
I would use the word proportionate. That's what just war is about, a proportionate response. And there's also not just an element related to preventing the next attack. There's also an element of justice, not necessarily retribution, but justice, and that's important.
Would it be important for whoever might be on the delivering end of another large attack to know what sort of response there might be against them, or is it better to leave people in doubt?
Well, I'm a big believer in stealth and speed and agility, and if you look at the intelligence reporting we had about Al-Qaida and the Taliban during 9/11 and right after 9/11, they expected one of two responses from the United States. They knew there would be a response, but they expected that we would either lob a few cruise missiles in like we had done before.
In '98 after the
Right.
embassy bombings.
That's correct. Or we would do nothing like happened after the USS Cole attack. And then they thought, well, the U.S. might mass its forces, but that would take weeks, months, and then they would have an invasion of Afghanistan. The last thing they expected is that we would drop teams of CIA and Special Operations commandos behind their lines, partner with Afghan tribal leaders, and engage in extensive subversion, sabotage, and form an Afghan victory. That was nowhere in their calculus.
Might it conceivably have been a deterrent to them if they'd known that was the likely response, or no, is it not worth thinking
No,
about?
I think if you're engaged in existential war, deterrence it doesn't work. It's not like you're dealing with a nation state where they'll make a calculation that, okay, we can reduce our arms or we'll flex this way. It's a different fight, and you have to come at it from a different perspective.
Okay, let me open this up to whoever would like to ask a question of either of you. There's some hands in the back, and if we can get a microphone to the gentleman with the blue tie, you're heading right toward him. Why don't you take that first? Sir.
My name is Keith Amaker. I'm a Director of Homeland Security Studies at Tulane University in New Orleans. I'm also retired Navy, and I spent a year in Afghanistan on the staff of CSTC Alpha as a strategic planner. And I'm curious about the Afghan National Development Strategy. Any comments from you all? The London Compact signed in early 2006 decided broad developmental goals for Afghanistan, including electrification. And nobody seems to know when I talk about ANDS what I'm talking about, and no one seems to know what the London Compact is. So in the international community, is ANDS dead? I know the Germans I work with in police reform, for example, they haven't done their job. So is ANDS a dead issue, or is it still alive out there as far as the international community is concerned?
For my benefit, what does ANDS stand for?
Afghan National Development Strategy, signed off by the international community in London in 2006, called the Afghan Compact, also known as the London Conference, follow on by two other agreements, Bond 1 and Bond 2, which were the agreements upon the European community, ISAF, the United States, on how we were going to fix Afghanistan.
Richard Barrett still inspires the Security Council?
No, I think the ANDS is still very much alive. If you remember, of course, on 20th of July, there'll be a Kabul conference, which is a follow-up, indeed, to the London conference. But the point is, I think what surprised people is the difficulty of delivery. If you look at what the coalition forces have in Afghanistan, all their means at their disposal are military means. They don't have so much civilian means. They don't have a very good civilian partner to work with. There's lots and lots of NGOs, but the NGOs, their work is uncoordinated, it's often duplicative, it's ineffective, and it's not actually developing the communities that we want to develop. It's not getting into the areas where we need to provide that development to wean people away from support for the insurgency. And until there's a build-up of the Afghan National Army, the Afghan National Police in particular, which remain incredibly weak despite the huge effort that's gone into it and the huge amount of money that's gone into it, they're not going to be the conditions that allow the delivery of aid and development into those areas. And I think these are problems that everyone's still grappling with. And unfortunately, in Kabul, no doubt, there'll be further pledges of more money. But one of the things that is, the main thing, I think, that has really corrupted Afghanistan and made it such a difficult problem to address is precisely the amount of money that's flown in there. It hasn't been able to absorb that money. It's resulted in huge corruption. Everybody thinking of the moment, their opportunity for the moment to stuff as much in their pockets as they can before the whole thing stops, and nobody believing in the future. So it's not dead, it's just very, very difficult.
There was another question in the back. This young lady on the right.
Hi, Sarah Catanzaro from the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. Earlier, we were talking about leadership decapitation, and you mentioned the hunt for bin Laden, Zawahiri, and the rest of Central Command. But other analysts have suggested that we may be better off targeting the gatekeepers who link together various cliques, or experts with knowledge that is not transactive. Can you talk to this strategy of network disruption?
Crumpton?
I think at an operational level, network disruption is important, because if you have operational team that's coming to attack our communities, well, you want to stop them. So I'm not dismissing that. But from a strategic perspective, the emphasis is on enemy leadership. It's not either or, you have to pursue both. And at an operational level, going to an earlier question, the degree of cooperation among the intelligence services worldwide in law enforcement is really unprecedented. We're doing remarkable things with a variety of traditional allies and very new allies. So at an operational level, we're doing pretty well overseas. In fact, I think we're doing better overseas than we are in the homeland.
Would you make your way over to this table?
Kim Dozier with the Associated Press. The by, with, and through method that you describe for bringing Afghan forces up to speed, or Pakistan forces up to speed, well, it takes a lot of time. The first question I have is, in Afghanistan, does the timetable that is currently put forward by the Obama administration, does that war with a policy that you'd recommend for ultimate success there? And then the second question would be, this morning we heard Mike Leiter speak to the necessity of having boots on the ground to disrupt terrorist networks. He said that was essential in Afghanistan. Does that mean it's what we should be pushing for in the federally administered provinces in Pakistan?
Richard, do you want to take one of those?
Well, on that second point, boots on the ground, well, certainly if you want to know about local networks, it helps to have your own people there. But if they can't speak Pashtun or they can't communicate with the locals in any other way, then it's going to be very difficult for them to understand what local networks are operating. I mean, the Taliban, even at the sort of local commander level, is just as likely to be digging in a field as he is to be shooting at you from inside a compound. It's very difficult to distinguish a Taliban from a non-Taliban. So you do need that sort of intelligence. But that is an insurgency. And it's slightly different, I think, from a terrorist movement. You can't deal, obviously, with terrorist movements with boots on the ground. If you look at the Fatah, I think if there were American troops inside Fatah, and I'm not saying they're not, but I'm saying if there were publicly American troops inside Fatah, it would really help the Pakistan Taliban a lot. Because I think that one thing that glues everybody together in this very messy part of the world is a common enemy. And at the moment they have that common enemy in the fact of these foreign soldiers. And that basic demand that the Taliban make is, we want all foreign soldiers out of here, is actually one that resonates pretty well. So if you have more boots on the ground, more visible boots on the ground, I don't think you necessarily achieve your purpose. If you have boots on the ground which aren't particularly visible, then probably you do.
Hank Crumpton, is the timeline, as you understand it, at war, to use Kim Dozier's phrase, with the kind of successful war you can imagine?
The timeline is driven, I think, more by our own domestic politics than I believe some need to generate urgency. I might be wrong. I don't know much about American politics, but that's my sense of it.
You've been on the road a lot.
Yeah, I've been on the road. And I think it's really artificial. Example, what could change that timeline? Another attack in the homeland. And if it emanates from the tribal areas, what does that timeline mean? What about the Afghan forces? They have a vote. What if there's civil war in Afghanistan? I hope not, but there's growing ethnic tensions in Afghanistan. How does that impact the timeline? So I really think it's artificial, and again, I don't see the need to telegraph that to the enemy, because they use it to their advantage.
But ideally, what it sounds like you would want, you don't have a party running for office, running for Congress next November, or you don't face a re-election yourself. You would want to reserve the flexibility to say maybe we'll increase troop levels if need be.
Of course.
Which doesn't seem to be in the cards right now as a lively political option.
I mean, if you're in a knife fight, you're not going to say we have 1 minute to fight. You're going to fight till somebody wins.
Can I just add something on the Afghan army and so on? The Afghan army will take a very, very long time to train up to any sort of competent level. They're way, way behind. There's no good professional officer corps. The illiteracy rates are very high. There's not a proper ethnic distribution among the officer corps. Retention levels are still low. You know, people do initial training, then go home and stay home, and so on. So there's an awful lot of work to be done there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you fill the gap by introducing more forces from overseas. Because if you introduce more forces from overseas, they push into areas where the Taliban is relatively in charge, but relatively quiet. You're going to get friction.
But the only variable that works to make that checkout is time. To say, therefore, you simply have to stay there longer in order to wait for them.
Should you fight during that time, or should you not fight? Should you just train during that time? I mean, I don't think that fighting has really, reduced Taliban to smaller areas of Afghanistan. In fact, they're pretty widespread right now, and that's an assessment by the Afghan government, not by me. So it may not be a good idea to carry on fighting while you're training. You have to support a political process while you're training. And I don't think, also, as a model, it's not a very good idea to train an army to fight its own citizens. You should train an army to defend your borders.
If I could expand on that with just a brief story. I had a discussion with Ahmed Shah Massoud. You may recall he was known as the Lion of the Panjshir because he had repelled repeated Soviet invasions into his home valley. Yes, and 2 days before 9/11, Al-Qaida assassinated him. Well, this was about 18 months prior to 9/11. I had a long discussion with Massoud about a range of operations that we were running in partnership with him, collection and sabotage operations against Al-Qaida, Taliban. At the end of this discussion, Massoud, who's a very charismatic, very polite man, he asked, could he inquire of me one thing? And I was in his safe house surrounded by his men, so of course I said, yes. Of course you can ask. And he said, the United States of America, the great nation, I have such admiration for your country. But my question is, does your country care more about Al-Qaeda and killing bin Laden or more about the people of Afghanistan? And I told him the truth. I said, well, the only people that you're talking to from the U.S. government is the CIA, and our mission is singular. It's focused on Al-Qaida. So frankly, we care more about that mission. And he gave me the saddest smile and nodded. He knew the answer. I think he was testing me to see if I had enough gumption. But he was, to tell him the truth, but he was also teaching me a lesson which is very important when we think of conflict. It's not about just finding and engaging and killing the enemy, and Massoud was very good at that, but it's also about the people, and you've got to do both. And until we address the non-military part of this conflict in Afghanistan and other counterinsurgencies, we're going to be back fighting for the same valley year after year. This is about the people. And if you look at classic counterinsurgency, 80% of that power projection is non-military. It's about economic development, it's about education, health care, it's about hope. And that applies to the tribal areas of Pakistan as much as it does to Afghanistan. And we've done a lousy job of that to date. And that's what we have to address. That's far more important than the kinetic power projection.
Let's get another question from near the front here. Hi.
Hello, Pamela Brown from Fox News. I just wanted to ask either one of you if you have any information you can share on whether or not Al-Shabaab is becoming more involved in the Gulf of Aden and inserting themselves into the piracy problem. Thank you.
Has there been, do we know of any crossover between the Yemeni Al-Shabaab and piracy? What do you think, Richard?
I haven't seen any of that. Al-Shabaab have been quite critical of piracy. They don't think it's good for Somalia, and they don't think it's good for them either. I mean, clearly piracy is a huge business and a very well organized business and goes way beyond the capabilities of Al-Shabaab, who are relatively unsophisticated. There are very, very strong elements all over Somalia which are involved in piracy. Al-Shabaab Al-Shabaab takes a very sort of puritanical view towards how Somalia should be run, and indeed has a certain amount of support, I think, because of that, because some of the areas it controls are relatively stable. And I think that if it goes anywhere, it will go somewhere because it manages to present itself as a group which at least could keep control of that area of Somalia in a relatively sort of untroubling way. I mean, everything they say at the moment suggests they're not like that, but that should ultimately be their objective. Somalia is a small war. It involves maybe 2,000 people really or so. It's not a big war. Piracy, if all that money from piracy came into it, it might become a big war because they'd be fighting over bigger spoils.
Any thoughts on Somali piracy?
I agree with what you've said. What concerns me more about Al-Shabaab is they do have links, not strong links, but they do have links to Yemen, to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and to Sydney, Australia. So a perfect example of this being a global battlefield. You can pick a relatively small, you would think, insignificant insurgency, but given our communications, given the migration of people, it can unravel pretty quickly, as the Aussies found out through a very intensive and successful investigation last year.
Do I have time for one more question? One more question. Who's got a microphone? This fellow in the back, I'd meant to.
Sean Waltman from the
Sean.
Washington Times. As you, I'm sure, know, there were very senior officials in the last administration who would say that Britain and Israel were our only true allies and would snort derisively if you mentioned France, Germany, or Canada. What is your own view of Ambassador Crumpton in particular? What is your own view of who the real allies, the best allies of the United States are in this conflict? And I'd like you also, in particular, to address the question of countries in the Middle East, some of whom are still seen by many as really trying to play both sides in this conflict.
Sure, that's a great question. First of all, I have enormous respect and gratitude for those allies who are fighting with us, and there's been a loss of life in some of those countries. Canadians have been with us. They fought bravely, as have other allies. So first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that. If you look at some of the most effective allies in this type of conflict, though, it's not necessarily NATO members or NATO itself. It really is about local allies. And the late Tip O'Neill talked about all politics being local. Well, in this kind of fight, it's both global and also very, very local. And if you don't have local allies, it's going to be a really tough slog. And most of those allies in these parts of the world are non-state. These are non-state actors that we have to find, we have to assess, we have to build alliances with. And it's often hard for us to do that because we see the world as in a mirror image. We want to deal with the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or local law enforcement, when in fact, the local ally, the power might be some tribal militia. So that's an important point. But then if you look at the nation-state level, they've been some very effective allies. The Jordanians, the UAE. The UAE, they have got special forces deployed into Afghanistan. They're the only Arab ally that has done that. And they're on, I think, their 6-year rotation. They're good allies.
I think Sean's phrase about friends who might be playing both sides is often people hear that and they hear Saudi Arabia at that moment. Saudi's on board fully as you.
Well, if you look at some of the non-state actors, some of the royal family, some of the businesses in Saudi Arabia, they're still funding Al-Qaida. I believe that's true. However, if you look, since May of 2003, when Al-Qaida launched attacks across Saudi Arabia, they really figured out it was a problem, and it was a sea change. And they are, I say, good allies. And Fran Townsend and I went to see the Saudis. This must have been in 2007, I think. And we talked to them, and our message was, you have to do more. We showed up, and the Deputy Minister of Interior was late. He finally showed up. He'd been up for 48 hours. He had just lost 3 men in a firefight. And our message to him was to do more. It was a pretty poignant moment for me, having this discussion with him. So yeah, they're good allies. Imperfect, but good.
Well, we talked about timelines earlier, so I've reached the point in our timeline when I have to thank both of you, Richard Barrett and Hank Crumpton. Thanks a lot for all of your insights and your answers. Well, that was great.
We'll have a 15-minute break and then reassemble promptly thereafter.
Great moderating, if I may say so.